This is hell.
When you see the nation to which you believe you belong as first and foremost, a nation whose mission it is to wipe out some adversary that can have some serious dehumanizing effects on not only your beliefs, but those who you would victimize as well. Viewing yourself and your compatriots as eternally repressed, locked into a deadly conflict since forever, is a disturbing narrative to embrace, and far too many on Israel's extremist far right are doing just that. Here to explain what's happening and why, Avi Garellick wrote the Hypocrite Reader article, "The Violence is the Point." Welcome to This Is Hell, Avi.
Thanks. It's an honor and privilege to be on the air with you.
Thank you very much for being on the show with us. You write that in May 2021, in the midst of a wave of nationalist violence by the Israeli state and vigilantes against Palestinians, a video clip caught fire on the internet. In the background, flames leap near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, while in the foreground, throngs of male religious Israeli youths mosh and sing in delight, a grotesque juxtaposition of recognizably buoyant concert culture with an image of destruction at a holy site. The song that boomed from a crane-rigged tower of speakers is an upbeat rock anthem by singer-songwriter Dav Shirin, a self-described rocker of salvation who graced the cover of The Economist in 1994 holding an Uzi and a Torah. A rocker endorsed by the most capitalist of media outlets who is armed with a deadly weapon and a faith's most important religious document while finding joy in expressing dehumanizing hate. That image has it all. And I know this is kind of a big question, but what does that image say about Western civilization when mass culture, money, violence, and religion are celebrated alongside the demonization of the other? What has civilization become?
What has civilization become? Wow, great question, Chuck. I put that a description of that Economist cover in the introduction to the piece because the piece is essentially about this uncomfortable juxtaposition of scholarship and violence, holding an Israeli-made weapon in one hand and the ageless Sefer Torah in the other, as Dovshurin does. It sort of creates this, like, for me, terrifying image of the crossbreeding of scholarship and vengeful violence. And it kind of like, as far as what has civilization come to? Yeah, like one of the like founding documents of Jewish civilization is here being like telescoped into this like much more recent Israeli cultural military product. And you got this guy with this long beard saying like, I represent what Jewish civilization is all about. And I have no problem opening fire on my enemies. We're kind of at this point in history where, catastrophe after catastrophe has piled up and everything has, from past and present has telescoped into a utterly terrifying future.
Yeah, exactly. You then describe another disturbing image, writing observers of Israeli far-right youth culture might have experienced a sense of deja vu, as in December 2015, a video of boys dancing to the same song had inspired a wave of shock and unease. At the wedding of a prominent settler family, celebrants danced to the Shurin song while toting Molotov cocktails and IDF-issued guns and knives. One boy stabbed a picture of a Palestinian toddler recently killed in a firebomb attack by settler terrorists who were personal friends with many guests at the wedding. The short clip provided undeniable evidence, not just of genocidal terrorist violence by settlers, terrorists in the sense that they committed political violence unsanctioned by the state, but also of an endemic culture that condones, celebrates, and even sanctifies it. Does this constant state of occupying others' land and the continuing process of taking that land from others who have lived and built on it, for that ongoing process to continue, do you think it must be celebrated if it was not Could it continue? Is celebrating necessary for an occupation's sustainability? Does settler colonialism have to be made into something fun to hide its brutality and allow its continuation?
That's a good question. And it kind of brings us to the complicated relationship between these settlers who are kind of at the forefront, the vanguard of Israel's settlement project, the relationship between them and just kind of the more mainstream elements. What would it look like if we didn't have these guys and we just had, the kind of urban planning projects that the Netanyahu government is engaged in, that offers. But you've also got people who are living in settlements who are just there because that's where the cheaper housing is, right? And those people aren't jumping up and down, right? They're just kind of complicit pawns in a larger project, but they're going about their lives and commuting, back over the Green Line every day. So, I don't know. The question you're asking kind of poses the prospect that these kinds of celebration are like the pulsing heart of the project of settlement, or like the uncovered id. And that might that might be true. But there are also all of these, there are all of these flavors of settlement activity, and it's tempting to say it's all kind of being pulled into this abyss. But I don't, can't say that with confidence.
And it's important. That's a really good point that you make. It's important to distinguish the people who are doing the celebrating from the people who are the settlers. Are the people who are doing the celebrating very often not the settlers? And what does that reveal about the people who are celebrating, that they are not the settlers, yet they're the ones who celebrate the settlement the most?
Yeah, well, I think the ones who really are celebrating the most are settlers, though there are, supporters on the other side of the Green Line, as well as in the U.S. Really, like, the people at that wedding have been immersed in this culture since their birth. And, and I just want to say, I was a teenager in 2005 when the government of Israel enforced the withdrawal from the settlements in Gaza. And that sparked a whole wave of anti-government feeling in what is now a new generation. I mean, if you were born in 2005, the year that, your family got dragged out of, your settlement house in Gaza, right now you're turning 16. So these are the kids who are moshing at the Western Wall. They have this kind of really interesting, if terrifying, oppositional attitude to the state, which it's worth exploring because they hate. Another example of this kind of scene, which I uncovered in some research, is back in 2010. There were a couple of arrests at a Purim celebration in Hebron, where teenagers had T-shirts like Ariel Sharon is a traitor and will soon die, or we got Rabin, who was assassinated in 1995. They're at this. They're immersed in this culture. They're out there. They see it as their whole life, and they are they're prepared to kind of take this oppositional attitude and use it to goad the state into legitimizing them. If that makes sense.
Is this kind of celebrating deadly violence only done by a small minority? And how much influence does this small minority have? Because it does not take a majority to cause real change.
That's right. And I think it is absolutely a small minority that is engaged in this. And I'm too far removed from, I've never lived in Israel or Israel Palestine. I'm too far removed from it to say how much tacit acceptance or approval they have. But I know that it only takes that small minority to make change, like you said. Previous prime ministers like Sharon and Netanyahu have been adept at using this kind of pressure from the far right to move forward on their right-wing agenda.
You point out that Dov Sharin's ghastly anthem draws its lyrics from a scriptural source. Recall me, pray, and strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may avenge myself in one act of vengeance from the Philistines for my 2 eyes. A prayer spoken by the super-strong Israelite hero Samson. Weakened, captured, and blinded by his Philistine oppressors, Samson is paraded around for their enjoyment at a large party full of noble men and women. Leaning on 2 pillars for strength, he calls out to God and summons his old powers, breaking at the pillars and collapsing the whole pavilion onto himself and 3,000 revelers, killing more in his death than he had in his life. The song makes one and only one fan-pleasing update to the scripture, the replacement of Philistines with Palestinians. And you point out that it seems evident why Samson's prayer might serve as a nationalistic Jewish ballad. It's a call to God for vengeance and victory over an enemy people. But why do Israeli settlers sing a song about overcoming an oppressor nation even when they enjoy a position of dominance? So is this, in a sense, settler colonial denialism? Is the story sung this way in order to promote a narrative that, in fact, there is no oppressive colonialism going on, that Palestinians are not expressing or experiencing any oppression?
Yeah. I mean, I think at the core of the ideology here is this kind of transhistorical attitude about the Goyim. Part of my method in writing this essay is kind of about noticing gaps between the foundational myths or stories and the ideology that is appropriating them. So this identity, for instance, this identity between the Palestinians and the Philistines, there's a coincidental similarity in names. But the Philistines, who were they? I mean, were they just like random Goyim who might as well have been, the Amorites or the Amalekites? Not really. I mean, they were, if you read the book of the Bible closely, you can tell they are likely a seafaring nation of conquerors who colonized a western region in Canaan, right near the coast, and who had advanced military technology, chariots, that made it possible for them to take advantage of neighboring peoples like the Israelites. The right-wing Zionists kind of give away the game because sometimes the Palestinians are Philistines, but sometimes they're Amalekites, right? Which are biblical enemies never conflated within the Bible itself, right? The Bible has a very clear idea of who the different peoples are. But for right-wing kind of Jewish fundamentalists, or Zionist fundamentalists, I should say, you can slot in any enemy people for the other, so that basically the Palestinians are responsible for the Holocaust, or might as well be.
So you also point out that to understand the resonance of the Sharon song more fully, we need to return to Samson's story and to the story of Sharon's intellectual godfather, the infamous rabbi and provocateur, Meir Kahane. Is this a retelling or maybe even a mistelling of the Torah, or was Meir Kahane's simply a different reading and interpretation of the Torah and the story of Samson? Is this a purposeful misreading, or is this just somebody else's interpretation?
Yeah, good question. Right. I mean, Kahana was really fond of saying, you're going to call me an extremist, but this is just Torah Judaism. This is just the halakha, right? The Jewish law. applied in a plain way. And I talk about in the essay how part of the allure of Kahana's ideology is his appeals to common sense. And so he kind of, he exploits contradictions in liberal ideology and basically encourages liberals to throw off their, their constraining superego and embrace what they believe to be like really true, which includes what they believe to be really true about Jewish tradition and texts. So that's his take is kind of like, just read this and see what it says. Like, open the book of Deuteronomy. It says, drive out the idolatrous nations from the land of Canaan. You don't want us to do that? That's what it says in the book. But go ahead and read the rest of the Hebrew Bible to see how that plays out. The Israelites become enamored of this idea of their inherent superiority, right? In the book of Kings, they take God's grace for granted, and they end up nearly annihilated and driven out of the land themselves by foreign powers. So there's a overall moral and political message of the Hebrew Bible that's being ignored by Kahana, right? The book of Deuteronomy is not a good primer on international relations. It never has been. It hasn't been in the rabbinic tradition applied in a straightforward way. Similarly with the story of Samson, and part of what I'm doing in the essay is offering myself a plain reading of the story of Samson and showing how he is, kind of a selfish brute. And I didn't get so much into this subtle textual analysis, but the book of Judges describes him, for instance, as doing what is right in his own eyes, which is a simple phrase, but in the book of Deuteronomy, again, is it's kind of a key recurring phrase that describes what's the wrong thing to do, right? You do what's right in your own eyes instead of following God's commandments. And that's supposed to be kind of the beginning of a slide into immorality and idolatry, right? So the story of Samson is clearly what's happening is that he's a brute. He's not a straightforward hero by any means. And so there's this kind of mystery, which is implicit in the text of why is he a pawn in God's plan for the Israelite people when he's clearly not personally worthwhile. So Kahanist rabbis who today are using Samson in their sermons in settlement yeshivas, they're glossing over that, or they're adopting some of the more disturbing elements of the story as positive. And that's a particular interpretation. That's a path that they're taking. Does that make sense?
So, and you give a brief history of Meir Kahane, saying that as a regional leader of the Greater New York B'nai Akiva Zionist youth movement and a congregational rabbi of a conservative synagogue in Howard Beach, Kahane amassed a following for his charismatic leadership. In 1968, he founded the Jewish Defense League, a vigilante self-defense group that sought to project an image of Jewish strength and virility, polarizing New York City by roaming around with baseball bats and lead pipes. Strongly opposed to the Black Power movement, the JDL amplified claims of black anti-Semitism and black crime against elderly Jews in changing neighborhoods, using this narrative as a pretext to bully black people, all while appropriating the Black Power fist for their logo. Kahane even trained young men in a shaya, a Hebrew word for wild animal, a shaya squad that was encouraged to get in touch with their animal instincts and passion for violence. At its height, the group's membership exceeded 15,000 people after a Jewish secretary in Manhattan died following a JDL bombing in 1972. However, the group lost most of its public presence and organizational strength. I didn't have this question written down, but while reading that, to what degree is baked into this Kahanist view of Zionism, how much is white supremacy baked into that?
Yes, good question. So I think it's really important in thinking about Kahana's biography and the movement that he spawned to put him in context in Brooklyn. where he was born in 1932, and where he founded the JDL in 1968. Right? What's significant about 1968 in New York City? How much did New York change between 1932 and 1968? Right. The thing is that, you've got this rise of a militant Black Power movement, and specifically how that played out in Brooklyn was this cataclysmic political struggle of the Ocean Hill, Brownsville teachers strike and the community control movement there. Right, basically the unionized teachers, mostly Jewish, went on strike. I believe because of an attempt to fire one of them in a mostly Black school in Brooklyn, and then the Black community sort of lashed out against the white, again mostly Jewish teachers, and said we want community control, and it was this whole ugly fight, which revealed kind of the contradictions of the mainstream narrative of New York liberalism and cosmopolitanism, and really shook white Jewish New Yorkers to their core, and made them really question kind of their role in the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. Now, meanwhile, of course, for decades already, Jews with the means to do it had been going out to the suburbs and abandoning these neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx, and leaving some poorer Jews behind, which was a big opportunity for Kahana, and a lot of the JDL rhetoric and actions of the time were focused on protecting the vulnerable, poor and elderly Jews who were left behind. Now, despite what you might think with Kahana's rhetoric about Jews versus Goyim, in Brooklyn with the JDL, they were mostly concerned with the anti-Semitism of Black people, not elite white anti-Semitism, not kind of ethnic feuds between Jews and the Italians and the Irish. He actually had some close alliances with Italian mobsters. So there's a disjunction there, or a contradiction, right? He has no problem, apparently, that I can find with the white Gentiles of Brooklyn. It's all about attacking the increasingly militant and class-conscious Black Power movement. So yeah, I would say white supremacy is underlying that, and then he's kind of importing Brooklyn white supremacy to the Israeli milieu later in his career.
So without Kahana, do you think that there would be this extremist far-right violence that we're seeing by some in Israel today?
Well, it's sort of a foolish proposal to say everything comes down to one guy.
Right.
And, I think when, as a writer, when I'm putting forward this kind of thesis that uses a charismatic figure like Kahana as the kind of case study, I'm always trying to draw stuff back to him. Look at Baruch Goldstein, who your listeners may know of. He massacred dozens of worshipers at a mosque in Hebron in 1994. So to this day, I think the deadliest act of vigilante terrorist violence by a far-right extremist in Israel. He was one of the founding members of the JDL, which, by the way, means that he joined it as a 12-year-old, since he was born in 1956. So you can trace a lot of the major, the kind of foundational events of extremist far-right Zionism to Kahana. But he's part of the world that he lives in. And he's not the only guy to show up making Aliyah from Brooklyn, having seen what he saw. He's just, he's kind of a charismatic figure that rallies these ideas around him.
And you write that Kahana had already been convicted in federal court for conspiracy to manufacture explosives and moved to Israel while out on probation. There he began laying the groundwork for Koch, a political party that would excoriate mainstream parties for tolerating Arab presence in Israel and predict that Arab demographic strength would destroy the Jewish state. Why is there so much violent fear around being demographically outnumbered by those who are not Jewish in Israel? Do Jewish people in Israel fear that if the Palestinians outnumber them, there will be a Holocaust? And should they?
Good question. That's exactly what they're thinking. Now, Kahana is always pushing this idea that there's going to be another Holocaust. He did it in the United States, even though that makes no sense. And obviously Jews are a demographic minority in the United States, and as a whole have done pretty well for themselves. But yeah, he is obsessed with this idea that the only way to protect Jews from another Holocaust, this time at the hands of Arabs, is to maintain a demographic majority in an ethno state. This is not unique to him. I mean, there's a lot of Zionists throughout history who thought this was the only way to maintain safety. I think, go back to the Dreyfus affair and Herzl. He was sitting around in the assimilated Jewish context and saw Dreyfus defamed as a Jew by the French, and thought the only way forward here is a Jewish state of our own. Now, I want to say about this line of thinking, which Kahana promoted, that he kind of, how do I say this? He projects his own style of ethnic supremacy onto the world, and sees it as only natural that any people that maintains a demographic majority within a country will oppress minorities and treat them as aliens. I want to quote Jackie Mason, the Jewish kind of Borscht Belt comedian who died this week. He was a supporter of Meir Kahana, and he told the reporter and author Robert Friedman, when asked about his support for Kahana, he said, democratic principles shouldn't apply to Israel like they do in America. If Arabs multiply to such an extent where they become as numerous as Israeli Jews, they can vote out the Jews and end the Jewish state. Jews would become aliens in their own country. And that's the problem. And that's why Meir Kahana is right. You are stupid. And so are people like yourself who say how terrible we are to the Arabs. Okay, so he was a bad guy. And just since he died recently, I wanted to denigrate his name. He's also making this leap in characterizing how democracy works and saying that as soon as the Jews become a minority demographically, they would become aliens in their own country, as though, any naturalized people in a democratically run country become aliens. We know that's not how it works, and it's just self-evidently outmoded as a way to think about democratically run countries,
When you're talking about the story of Samson, you mentioned that Kahane was something of an ideological seducer, adept at revealing flashes of his ideology to people who may never have been attracted to the whole thing. This ability is why he continues to pose a threat, precisely because he continuously exerted himself as a public propagandist. presenting toxic and catastrophic violence as a matter of simple self-defense. Are those who are his followers or share his beliefs, then are they not necessarily the most religious or have the most religious training or knowledge? Who are the people who may never have been attracted to the whole thing, but were once they heard Kahana speak or read his writings?
Yeah. So I mentioned Jackie Mason. He's think of him as being an ultra-Orthodox guy. I also in the piece mentioned Bob Dylan, who inexplicably told Time magazine, Kahana's a really sincere guy. He's really put it all together. These are sort of American Jews who have not embraced a Torah lifestyle at all, right? And Mason more than Dylan, perhaps. But they see some appeal in this sort of Jewish supremacist ideology, as long as it's presented in a piecemeal fashion. I think Kahana, fundamentally as a writer and as a propagandist, was a master of esoteric presentation. He would say as much as was needed while leaving the more extreme elements as subtext. I think if he had gone out to synagogues or to, Hadassah meetings or to college campuses in the U.S. and said, the whole point of the Zionist enterprise, as he believed, is to take eternal revenge over the Goyim, people would have been terrified and alienated by his ideas. So I wanted to describe to you this full page advertisement in the New York Times, which the JDL took out in summer of 1969.
Go ahead.
It says, question, is this any way for nice Jewish boys to behave? Then it's got a picture. Okay. The picture is like, there's these 6 Jewish guys and they're holding like, baseball bats and pipes. It says, answer, maybe there are times when there is no other way to get across to the extremist that the Jew is not quite the patsy some think he is. Maybe some people and organizations are too nice, etc. And the ad ends. Well, the ad ends with a fundraising appeal, and before that it says, nice Jewish, Christian, white, and black boys should create a society of justice and equality in which people can get back to being nice. So the message of the ad is we have to be tough guys in order to assert our rights, and we should work towards justice and equality to get back to being nice. Now, he was not, the JDL was not creating an interfaith, multiracial, effort to, towards justice and equality. They just said that at the end so that people would feel good about it and donate to them. And that worked. The journalist I mentioned before, Robert Friedman, did a great job tracing how substantial donations from affluent American Jews provided the basis for Kahana's activities. I would say on one hand, I'd say they're duped, but on the other hand, I'd say Kahana is really playing on contradictions within the liberal Jewish American psyche and kind of, getting people to put some money towards this vision of the tough, masculine Jew who's going to defend the weak.
And you were mentioning earlier about this Kahana's view of democracy, about how all it is when the winners take office, they repress the losers. You write that Kahana was an expert at pulling at the dark edges of the American Jewish psyche, which in those days was still overwhelmingly liberal and democratic. Uncomfortable truths for comfortable Jews, he sneered in one of his book titles, boldly suggesting that if his audience were not so confused by affluence, they would already know what he had come to teach. Genocidal violence is plain spoken common sense. Fear-mongering, while claiming to, and many believing you are standing up for the little guy, as Kahana said, while wrapping yourself in the Torah, which attracts those who usually are not religious and know as little about the religion as you do. I hate to say this, but this sounds very very Trumpian, in very Fox News, just very where the Republican Party is today. Is Mayor Kahana the blueprint for someone like another New Yorker, former President Donald Trump, or is Kahana not as much a pioneer as he is one in a long line of using religion to dehumanize others while claiming to be doing it for the little guy?
Yeah, I think that's it. That would be an interesting line of research to trace kind of tropes that Kahana is using that have something in common with, I guess, like evangelical fundamentalism of the Christian stripe in the U.S. Haven't done that, and Trump obviously doesn't have a direct line. There's no direct lineage, right, between the fundamentalists and Trump. Right, Trump is a gaudy capitalist. He doesn't know the first thing about religion and doesn't talk about it that much. I don't know. I don't know about that. And I think the thing that's appealing, where Kahana gets his power, is from the specific status of Jews, who are a minority in the world, and who did suffer catastrophic loss in the middle of the century. It's hard to generalize from that. Kahana uses the specter of the Holocaust really adeptly, as we've mentioned, I think. And he also had this whole kind of bit of like righteous castigation of the liberal Jewish establishment, insofar as they kind of sat on their hands praising FDR while FDR did nothing to stop the Holocaust, which is, I think, a really attractive, like compelling point about the liberal Jewish establishment, and about, he kind of then leveraged that to this vision of a pugilistic Jewish type. So I think that sort of thing is particular to him, but there are common themes between his movement and Trumpism, insofar as it's kind of a project of revenge against the contradictions and excesses of liberalism.
And you point out that such credulous figures as Reuben Mattis, the founder of Haagen-Dazs, forked over big bucks while Bob Dylan mused to Time magazine that Kahana is a really sincere guy. He's really put it all together. And you write that Kahana raised money in the U.S. for educational purposes while funneling donations into building the infrastructure for a terrorist political party in Israel. While the Haagen-Dazs guy might have loved the pleasantly chauvinistic pride in Jewishness Kahana peddled in Connecticut, Kahana's core followers were buying into a catastrophic worldview of eternal strife and violence between Jew and Arab. Kahana's core followers were buying into a catastrophic worldview of eternal strife and violence between Jew and Arab. How self-perpetuating is that belief? Is a cause of strife between Arab and Jew Kahana's legacy of teaching that Arabs and Jews were engaged in eternal strife and violence?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say I find it, I'm tickled by the fact that in the week after I published this piece, there was an explosion of discourse around ice cream companies and Israel. Ben and Jerry's made waves by attempting to pull out of selling in the occupied territories. Haagen-Dazs became the kind of the alternative for right-wing Jews in the U.S. who want to withdraw their support for Ben and Jerry's. Many of them don't know that the Haagen-Dazs founder was actually really right-wing. So it's kind of fitting. Anyway, I described kind of later in the piece. I mean, somebody might be reading or listening along to this and thinking kind of skeptically, like, what's so special about Kahana? There's obviously a lot of conflict between Jews and Arabs, and there are a lot of Zionists who don't see Arabs as being a legitimate part of the state of Israel. So I just want to put a fine point on this, and sorry if we're going to get to this later, but Kahana's whole thing is that the very founding purpose of the state of Israel is to enact vengeance against the Arabs, the Palestinians in particular, though he thinks that's a fake identity, for the humiliation that the Jewish people have suffered for generations. So for him, it's eternal, because if the Arabs ever actually did emigrate en masse from the area and leave the Jews their Jewish state, his ideology would be kind of empty at that point.
And you write how Kahana delighted in pointing out the contradictions and delusions of liberal Zionism when it came to the Arab problem. That is, that liberal Zionists can't stomach admitting to themselves that they simply wish the Arabs would go away on their own. And you then quote Kahana writing, "The soothing legend of our good Arabs who are equal and free and who appreciate and love Israel is fed along with liver, chicken, and stuffed derma to the Hadassah's portly and younger suburban matrons." How important is that sexist machismo to Kahana's violent views, popularity? Is it an excuse for the excitement of hooliganism that morphs into street violence and even terrorism? How important is that sexist machismo to Kahana's thinking?
Really important, man. Yeah, that's a big part of it. Reading that kind of thing, my eyebrows shoot up to see his kind of sneering description of the matrons of Hadassah. The misogyny extends, of course, to the men of Jewish liberalism, who he sees as weak and effeminate, which is, of course, an anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews. So there's this kind of contradiction in his ideas, which he fights anti-Semitism but adopts anti-Semitic ideas. The machismo, it comes back to again the boys who are dancing to the Dov Shurin song at the Western Wall. There's this really intense kind of like bro culture going on here. They have this whole ideology of protecting Jewish women from the predations of Arab men. I think, the violence towards the other in this kind of, I'd say, fascist framework is coupled with control, domination of women, and a kind of sneering misogyny.
And you point out that eliminationist racism against Arabs is prevalent in Israel. From its beginning, Zionism has been marred by Jewish supremacy and virulent hatred for Arab peoples who got in the way of the vision of a Jewish society. Can there be Zionism, the project to build a Jewish nation, that is not marred by Jewish supremacy and virulent hatred for Arab peoples? Because the impression that we have now in the 2020s is that has always existed.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'll say I'm kind of, agnostic on the. It's sort of a question of definitions. Do you think of Zionism as being marred essentially by this racism against Arabs or not? I don't really know enough to say. I mean, I think that there are a lot of sort of liberal. Let's say this: there are a lot of liberal Zionists who are struggling with this, with these contradictions, and I guess I hope they work it out. one of the things which is sort of a time capsule in reading Kahana's stuff is how he describes the efforts of, the liberal Zionist leadership to kind of integrate Arabs, albeit as sort of second-class citizens, into Zionist society. And at the time of his writing, the Labor Party was still pretty much dominant in Israel. Now they've basically been decimated, and far-right projects of Zionism are much more ascendant. So I think, the project of liberal Zionism is kind of on the retreat. But I can't speak to its essence or anything like that.
So how many of Israel's problems, you point this out in your writing as well, but how many of Israel's problems and challenges, both internally and externally, are the result of its claim to be a secular state while having being a democratic secular state, while having a kind of theocratic identity, if you will? Are these two forces always at odds within Israel?
I think it's a real struggle, and I think Israel has made some really difficult wrong turns when it comes to the definition of the state as such and its relationship to Jewish identity. To the point where, Kahana, it was one of Kahana's big things was to say, this is the idea of a Jewish democracy is a contradiction in terms, and he was extreme for saying that at the time. I think it's become a much more popular view in the 21st century.
And one thing you pointed out, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to make sure that people understood this point, is, it would seem like Kahana, what he was pointing toward is that he wanted to see a genocide, that he wanted to see the end of the Palestinian people and what he believed was historic Israel. But you also point out that it's important to have the Palestinians still be around in Kahana's thinking. Why is it important for Palestinians to still exist despite broadcasting this view of genocide?
Yeah. And so it's kind of a contradiction for him. And, because you can't really have an eternal, I don't know, maybe you can, but he's got this kind of eternal genocide. He wants to drive out the Palestinians, but he wants to always be doing it. And this is because now there's this great article published in the year after his death, 1991, by Ehud Sprinzak, which analyzes some writings which were originally just circulated amongst Kahana's followers. And in those writings, he talks about this fundamental question of religious Zionism, right? Religious Zionism was not a popular ideology really before 1967. Zionism was predominantly secular, and Haredim and other ultra-Orthodox Jews rejected Zionism as a usurpation of Jewish identity, as a taint of the Holy Land, right? Because they hated secularism. Okay, so and they thought secular nationalism was bad. So religious Zionists are faced with this fundamental problem of how does a predominantly secular movement have theological positive significance? So the main way to think about this, pioneered by Rav Avraham Kook and his grandson Tzvi Yehuda Kook, is like basically that there's this kind of historical process of redemption of the Jewish people. Like secular Jews are a part of it, but it's also the telos of it is sort of this messianic like conversion of all Jews to the Torah over time. Now, Kahana sees things differently. He sees the whole thing as basically the state of Israel, like Samson in the book of Judges, is kind of an unwitting pawn of God's plan. And God, like the Jewish people, has been humiliated by Gentile dominance for centuries, and wants to use the Zionist project no matter how secular, to use it as a tool to enact vengeance on the Gentiles. So for Kahana, the state of Israel, he says this himself, the state of Israel is not really for the Jews, it's for the Gentiles. And by that, he means it's for vengeance against the Gentiles. Like I said before, it would be, without the Gentile, it would be kind of an empty project.
So that leads me to one last question for you, Avi. We've been speaking with Avi Garellick, who wrote the Hypocrite Reader article, The Violence is the Point, which you can find at hypocritereader.com. So our final question, as we do with all of our guests, I promise, it is the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. What you were just saying about Kahana and having the vengeance being in the centermost core aspect of what it is to be Israel and being Israeli. And as you point out in your writing, you write how followers of Kahana, like Bent-Zion Gopstein, head of Lahava, an organization opposed to miscegenation between Jews and Arabs, not to be able to marry, have expounded the tale as a model for their students, celebrating vengeance as the highest form of Jewish authenticity. What happens when your identity is guided by revenge? How does life change when you're always in a state of seeking vengeance? And can revenge ever be satisfied?
Yeah. Good question. So, I guess I want to use this question as an opportunity to say, zoom out and say, a lot of the right-wing resurgence of the last 50 years, not just in Israel, but also, again, back in the outer boroughs in New York, are founded on what we call a revanchist ideology, right? That's also revanchist, basically means revenge-oriented. Revanchist ideology towards the idea that the government is giving all of the support to poor people, to Black people, we need a kind of resurgence of police, repressive violence, et cetera, in order to kind of take back the city. That's some stuff that I've studied in different contexts, and I think that has, in common with Kahana's ideology, it has this push for vengeance. And I think the push for vengeance in that context is hiding a kind of conflict between the middle class and the poorer classes that's engineered by capital. So I think, we unfortunately haven't spoken that much about the role of capitalism in stoking vengeance, since the essay is focused on this kind of religious fundamentalism. But I think what happens when you tear back the veil of the vengeance and look for some core, I think you can find that there is kind of a goading of vengeful ideologies that is kept in place by kind of forces of capital that want to sow dissension between races, ethnicities, religions, and classes. So that's what we should always look for behind ideologies of vengeance.
So often, Avi, the answer to the question from hell is because capitalism. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. Avi Garellick wrote the Hypocrite Reader article, The Violence is the Point, which you can find at hypocritereader.com. Thank you so much, not only for your writing at Hypocrite Reader, but for you being the editor-in-chief of Hypocrite Reader and all of the great work that everybody is doing over there.
I got to say, while you mentioned that I'm an editor emeritus. I haven't actually been editing a Hypocrite Reader for a while.
All right, well, let's just keep that between you and I.
All
right, Avi, take care.
Sure.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.